Welcome, action fans, and thanks for joining us for another episode of All 90s Action All the Time, as we continue this season's look at the highs and lows of action cinema in 1995. I am your host, Scott Murphy, and still no Craig this year, but don't worry, he shall return in next month's episode, I think. I do, however, have a very special guest in the form of stand up and one half of the John Carpenter Appreciation Society, Nat Metcalf. Hi, Nat.
Hello.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. How are you?
Not bad at all. How are you?
Pretty good. I'm pretty good.
Yeah. Okay. So do you want to, before we kind of dive into the film that we're talking about today, I don't know why I'm being coy about the film that we're talking about today. It's in the
I know, it's very secretive.
If people have opened their phones and seen the title of the episode, they probably will know that we're covering Bad Boys. But before we get into that, tell us a little bit about your podcast that you do.
Well, me and Nick Helm we kind of do two podcasts. One is Consume and Obey, which is usually just me and Nick just talking, which ends up usually being about films, including often 90s films, not because we plan to, just because it tends to be what we end up talking about if ever we meet up. And that's a very kind of freewheeling, chatty podcast. And we've also got another one called Control the Airwaves, which is one that is much harder to organise, but involves us usually having a chat with someone from the comedy world, usually, where they select a perfect night of television from their favourite kind of kids show when they were little, right up to kind of present day movies, game shows, quiz shows and things, which we do less of because they are far harder to organise.
But it does sound very fun. There's a very fun concept.
Oh yeah,
perfect night of television. I don't know what my perfect night of television would be, but yeah, that sounds very fun.
Would it involve Bad Boys?
It would not involve Bad Boys.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. No. As we'll find out. I have a lot of nostalgia for Bad Boys. But I don't think it's an amazing film. But I don't think it's a terrible film either.
Okay.
So we'll discuss further on that.
Oh, wow. We'll delve into this.
Yes. So usually, before we delve into that, I give some stats for the audience. So your stats for today. Bad Boys was released on April 7th, 1995, or it certainly was in the States. It was directed by the Rob Liefeld of action cinema, Michael Bay, who normally at this point I read out notable credits, but probably if you're listening to this podcast, you know who Michael Bay is. But if you really don't, his other films include the likes of The Rock, Armageddon, and Transformers. The script went through multiple hands, but was based on a story by George Gallo, whose most notable credit that I could find was Midnight Run. And the credited screenwriters include Michael Barry and Jim Mulholland, who were both apparently regular writers on the Late Show with Letterman, and also co-wrote the Sylvester Stallone comedy Oscar. It was also the other credited screenwriter was Doug Richardson, who is a novelist by trade, but also did screenplays for the likes of Die Hard 2 and Money Train, which we'll cover later in the year. Critically, it is sitting on 43% on Rotten Tomatoes, based on 69 reviews, 41 on Metacritic, based on 24 reviews. However, its kind of audience scores are better because it's got a 6.8 on IMDb, and a 3.2 on Letterboxd. Box office wise, it was a big hit as it made $141 million off of a $19 million budget, making it the 23rd biggest film of 1995, placing it just one behind the ensemble action-adventure Congo, but one ahead of the Hugh Grant, Julianne Moore romantic comedy 9 Months. And that's your stats for today.
Wow, they are interesting stats. I would have said Congo made about 40 pence. And similarly, 9 months. I think 9 months almost feels like a deep cut from 1995.
So
I mean,
yeah,
I would have thought Bad Boys would be way higher.
Yeah.
Nine months made over $140 million.
No, it was one behind. So
Oh, sorry.
so 9 months made $138 million.
Wow, but still,
Yeah, and Congo made $152 million.
that really shocks me. I remember that film sort of coming and going. It feels almost like an also ran now, Congo.
Yeah, no,
But
no, it's not well remembered, but it made a lot of money at the time.
but 23 seems like quite a bad place for Bad Boys when you think culturally it feels like it probably ought to be higher. I'd be interested to see the rest of that list.
Yeah, yeah. Well, no, I mean, there's a lot of interesting things. I like a film that we're covering later on in the year, Die Hard with a Vengeance, was the biggest film of 1995. Top
If
out,
I had to,
yeah,
I would have guessed that.
yeah, beating out even Toy Story to second place.
Wow. Still,
Yeah,
it's a banger though. It's a banger.
it's a great film. It's a great film. So yeah, I guess like culturally, Bad Boys has grown in reputation, and I think we've got to realize probably that like Will Smith and Martin Lawrence were not like they were stars because like Will Smith had Fresh Prince of Bel Air and Martin Lawrence had the sitcom Martin as well as like his stand up career and regularly hosting like Def Comedy Jam and stuff like that. But they weren't like movie stars at the time.
No, I remember Will Smith he'd been in 6 Degrees of Separation, which I'd gone to see, which is probably, so I was born in 79, so I'd been 16 or 15 or 16 when Bad Boys came out. And I'd also been to see 6 Degrees of Separation, which I think had come out the previous autumn, which sort of shows there must have been a thing with Will Smith, though, even though he's a TV star, that I think everyone in that era, especially people my age, were probably so beloved of the Fresh Prince of Bel Air that he sort of felt like he was a big star. He was a big TV star for me and my friends at school. So going to see, it felt like, well, let's go. Like the fact at 15, a group of us would have gone to see the drama 6 Degrees of Separation feels like quite quite a feat. So I think it must have been the draw of having the Fresh Prince in a movie that helped it along.
That does make sense. And I mean, in my sphere, Will Smith was certainly like a big star, like in my head when I was a kid. Because I'm slightly younger. I was born in 1985. But still, like Fresh Prince was like a big show for me. And I guess like Bad Boys is something that I came to like later. Like I think like I knew Will Smith from Fresh Prince, and then it was like the big one for me was like Independence Day, and then I think I must have bought Bad Boys on VHS maybe a couple of years after it came out, maybe like 97, so I'm probably when I was about 12, like maybe 97, 98, 12, 13 kind of age. So like I'd already like I think I'd probably already seen Independence Day and Men in Black before I got Bad Boys on VHS kind of thing. So yeah, I came to it a little bit later. But did you go to the cinema to see it?
Yeah, and it was quite a big deal. It was on. I think it was in the big Odeon they've got in Leicester Square as well. I remember it being quite a big release. I think it kind of came out in the Easter holidays. When you said April, I was thinking, well, I would have guessed it would be about April as well. I don't think it was out fully in the summer. I think it was a bit earlier, so maybe it was like a May or June or something. But I think we must have had it very soon after that in the UK. And yeah, I went to see it out on the big Odeon, and I think it was 95 was a real, like I'd always been a film fan, but I think 95 was probably when I probably started going more and more and getting more and more into it, I think. So it was quite an exciting release, I think. Plus, I would have been, it was a 15 certificate. It was Will Smith swearing. That was a new thing.
Yeah.
Lots of bad language. It was, and so I was exactly the right age for it to watch a sort of 15 action movie. So it felt slightly transgressive, but I would also have been about as young as I could have been and still got into the movie.
Yeah. Fair enough. And I take it from that like what, so was it the were you already just like an action fan, so it's the kind of thing you would go to, or was it Will Smith was the big draw for you at the time? Do you
I think
remember?
I think I would have been an action fan. Probably less so going in. This was probably one of the first sort of big action movies I would have seen at the cinema. And growing up, a lot of the kind of that was sort of the turning point, wasn't it? So before that, a lot of the action would have been your sort of Stallone or Schwarzenegger movies, which I would have been trying to see, but often would have maybe caught on TV rather than like because I would have been my parents would have been trying to dissuade me from seeing some 18 to action movie. I might have been able to smuggle the odd one on VHS or on TV, perhaps late at night. I think by then I would have seen the Terminator, perhaps both Terminator movies. But this, I think, would have been one of the first of the big kind of action movies I would have seen at the cinema.
Yeah.
This was kind of the new. It was kind of they were sort of part of it, weren't they? Because they were. It was sort of that time when they were kind of moving away from the kind of very muscle-bound action stars of the 80s. And even though Schwarzenegger and Stallone were still making movies, it felt like it was kind of there was a shift to people like Will Smith and Martin Lawrence. Although I guess everything about this, I guess, would have been more of them trying to do like a Beverly Hills Cop again. It's very much an action comedy, isn't it? It's not like a Lethal Weapon or a Beverly Hills Cop or something. It's not. It doesn't feel pure action. It's got it's very funny.
Yeah, it's got like it is very much an action comedy, and yeah, like you say, it's very much in that mold. And in fact, like with the kind of lower critical scores, they basically that was the main criticism of the movie, that this was like a retread of the buddy cop kind of comedy formula that we've seen in 48 Hours, in the Lethal Weapon movies, in the Beverly Hill Cop movies, and I guess there've been a lot of these at the time, particularly post Lethal Weapon. There was like an absolute splurge of like buddy cop action comedies in the kind of late 80s, early 90s. So by this stage, I think there was already quite a lot of fatigue around this particular action subgenre, which I think led to this getting, not terrible reviews, but certainly kind of middling, mediocre, kind of like, we're not into this kind of reviews.
I think as well that era of reviewers, especially in the UK. So at this time when I've been getting into movies, I would have been reading a lot of film criticism, and it felt like there was a sort of younger end of film critic as well. And I remember going into Bad Boys quite hyped because I think the younger critics actually did like Bad Boys. It felt like it was quite an exciting movie. Whereas I think it was at the time you'd have people like Alexander Walker still writing the kind of broadsheet kind of reviews of films. So people like that wouldn't like anything that was an action movie. They wouldn't. Whereas I think in 95, you're starting to get your kind of Kim Newmans and Mark Kermodes and things. And I guess Empire would have been a big magazine in the mid 90s. So I think the younger end, from what I recall, I think people really liked Bad Boys of the kind of things I was reading more of.
Yeah. No, that kind of makes sense. I wouldn't be surprised if like an Empire, because I can't remember when Empire first came on the scene, but I think it was like the tail end of the 80s or the very early 90s, something like that. I think it was like 89 or 90, something like that, if I remember correctly. So yes, and I guess like that kind of I guess that kind of magazine and that leans more towards the genre stuff and is more kind of towards the genre stuff generally, and doesn't have the kind of sniffy attitude towards like the genres I'm most into, action and horror.
Time Out, Empire. So they were kind of like hipper.
Yeah.
Kind of, especially at the time, Empire almost feels a bit like it's such an iron horse now of publishing and been going for so long.
Yeah.
But I think at the time it felt quite kind of hip. Empire and Premiere and later Total Film and things all felt like they were quite a sort of hip magazine for kind of films. They weren't as kind of stuffy. So I think you had like Sky Magazine and Time Out. They would have all been. They were slightly hipper from what I recall as a teenager to movies and things.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And when I kind of started getting into kind of things like that and reading more film criticism, like a few years after yourself, it would be that stuff that I kind of gravitated towards, for sure. I think like maybe before we get into the film, we've had some thoughts on Will Smith. We were definitely both Will Smith fans at the time. Um, I guess we should maybe talk a little bit about Michael Bay, who is probably probably along with Zack Snyder the most divisive director in action cinema. People love him, people hate him. Like, where do you kind of fall on the kind of love hate base scale?
Well, it's tricky, and I'm probably going to say the more we talk, I think it'll. I'm very mixed on it. I'm very mixed on it. So I would say in Bad Boys, it feels like Don Simpson, Jerry Bruckheimer movie.
Yeah.
And it feels like in this movie, he hasn't quite settled on becoming the Michael Bay that he will later become.
Yeah.
And what he's doing is Bad Boys more and more watching it this time felt like, oh, well, what Michael Bay is at the start, he's basically Tony Scott. He seems to desperately be trying to do like a Tony Scott impression even. And it's much more...
Yeah, that's hilarious because I put that in my notes that like Michael Bay is being Tony Scott Jr. here.
Yeah, absolutely is. And I guess at the time, I mean, this is the same year I think as Crimson Tide, and you think, oh yeah, so I guess he's probably like Don Simpson and Jerry Bruckheimer's like top director. He's probably their number one go-to, and it does feel like for a first-time filmmaker, it's probably really smart to go, I'm working for these producers. I think he was doing ads and sort of music videos and things before this.
That's
and
right.
so it kind of makes sense that you would just almost ape the style of Tony Scott. And it feels so, like everything about it it's like a Tony Scott movie, really. I prefer the second Beverly Hills Cop to Beverly Hills Cop. And I think that's partly because of how good the action is in the second Beverly Hills Cop. The first Beverly Hills Cop feels more like it is a sort of more of a kind of SNL kind of movie about cops, whereas I think Beverly Hills Cop 2 really feels like where they nail it, where you've still got the kind of humor, but it feels like a real action film. And I think this is similar, and I think it's kind of a good choice. I mean, I like Tony Scott, and I feel that this was quite it feels nostalgic almost watching it, like, oh, here we go. This is how they're supposed to look. This feels like the 90s action movie.
It does. And one of the way, like, it's interesting that like it immediately feels like a 90s action movie. And I think one of the ways that happens is like, for some reason, I don't know why this was decided on, but in 90s action cinema, like you kind of had like kind of you could, particularly from the mid 90s to the end of the 90s, you had kind of two choices. Like basically 90s action cinema loves a color filter. And like you basically shot your movie in these kind of blue hues that was like a lot of the cyberpunk movies did, and also like any kind of conspiracy thing like Enemy of the State and stuff. So it was blue, or you shot it as if it was shot on the sun. And this is and this is one of the orange filter shot on the sun movies.
Yes, it is.
And so immediately from the opening shot, you're like, God damn, this is 90s.
Yeah. And I like it. You know where you are. You know where you are when you're watching this. Like within like moments of this film starting, you kind of know. And also, I really like something about a 90s action movie is where it started. There's action going on, and they're still doing the credits. The credits are still appearing while the action is happening. That often has a kind of almost sort of 80s TV thing about it, where it's almost they've just got to get on with the show. It does, and it feels like it gives I quite like it. It gives a real urgency where a film, you may have covered it actually, Executive Decision has that, where it feels like you are so far into the film and you're still getting the credits coming up, production designer, and it's almost like it feels like there's a real urgency. Like we've just got to get on with it. We can't pause to. We can't just have a credit sequence.
Yeah.
We've got. This is going on. The film started, and so if you're trying to read who people are, it's well into the movie, and this has that a bit. It's not quite as bad as that executive decision. I remember being like, I think. I mean, spoiler alert. I think Steven Seagal is dead before it tells you who wrote it. I think it's sort of an extraordinary one. That kind of, but I like it. It feels like immediately it's a very nostalgic film. Bad Boys.
That's true. I've watched Executive Decision a few times, and we have covered it in the podcast because we did it like before we started doing like the kind of years we did like individual stars, and we had like a Kurt Russell season. And yes, like I'm sure this is not true, but Executive Decision, it does feel like you're still seeing credits like 20 minutes into the film.
Yeah,
like, yeah. Edited by. Oh right, okay.
It's like surely you must have got this by now, but it all just like I like it. The story's off and running, isn't it? Before like straight away, it's quite nice.
Yeah. And also, like the great thing about the opening scene of the movie, apart from the kind of like it really establishes that Martin Lawrence and Will Smith have great chemistry and like their banter back and forth is great, but two guys attempt to carjack them. They distract them. Like a beautiful woman works in front of the car, and then that distracts them, and then they get carjacked. And one of the carjackers is Kim Coates, from Sons of Anarchy, and and there's a bunch of like kind of random character actors who pop up in this movie, like because like later on. We've got like one scene of Kevin Corrigan, who people may know from the sitcom Grounded for Life, and we've got a couple of scenes with Michael Imperioli.
That's right.
Who people know from Sopranos. I'm sure, like, if people know him, they'll know him from Sopranos, I'm sure. Yeah, so like random cameos in this film.
Yeah, and I guess it is all filmed in Miami, so I don't know how easy it would have been to have like. Most films are either you've got those kind of Los Angeles actors and those New York actors, but I don't know of many. I mean, as a lot of them have been imported here, but I wonder if there is also like some kind of local Floridian actors that are knocking about that we maybe don't see in everything.
Yeah, maybe. I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure. Although I think like. I'm pretty sure that I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure that Michael Imperioli and Kevin Corrigan, I think they're East Coast anyway. I think.
Yeah, I'd imagine.
I think like Imperioli's probably a New Yorker. I don't know.
No, I would imagine.
Yeah. Corrigan seems like he might be a Boston guy, but I might just be guessing there.
I guess that's it. In Miami, I guess that's one of the things. I mean, outside of Scarface, I guess it's not really a city you would necessarily see a lot. It's not Los Angeles or New York. So I guess that's one of the things it probably has over other action movies, probably very deliberately, that they've gone, okay, we can't have it in Los Angeles again. Where else can it be?
Yeah, no, I guess that's true. Because I guess like the only thing people would have maybe related to Miami at the time would have been Miami Vice.
Yeah.
Which again is like that kind of buddy formula, but in TV.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So maybe it does give it a bit of a different vibe. Yeah. So I mean, like, what? It's Did you like that scene kind of establishing the chemistry? So because I mean, like it's not like a necessary scene, that kind of cold open where they're getting carjacked, because it's got nothing to do with the plot or anything. But I do think it's it's a good establishing scene,
Yeah, it really is, and it sort of says what the film is. From what I gather, the film was because it was originally was it written for John Lovitz and Dana Carvey, I think.
Yeah.
That was who they had in mind. And it was, and everything about the film sort of that could work. You could imagine that with two other comedians. But from what the impression you get is that what the script no one really liked, and most of it appears to have been improvised by Will Smith and Martin Lawrence, who seem to have almost virtually rewritten every scene because they don't like what's on the page. And that idea of them both getting into this, essentially being in a situation, it's one of those scenes where they are both incredibly level-headed by pretending to be incredibly angry with each other, which is what is how they get out of this situation. And it's a thing they do later. They do a sort of rehash of that in the most recent Bad Boys movie, and that's how that movie starts, with a very different kind of scenario, but it's the same principle, that they're arguing with each other, and by doing that they can get out of this situation. So it's good, it's funny, and it's a good thing where it shows it's Will Smith who's distracted by the woman walking past. It's not so much so it's very much establishing who these characters are. Will Smith is driving a car which is impossible for a policeman to afford. He's about to be carjacked because he's in this incredibly fancy car. It's a good scene, really, in terms of setting up lots of things about the plot.
Yeah. It's interesting as well because, like you say, he's driving a Porsche that apparently costs $105,000, which seems crazy for somebody who is a police officer. But it is established in very loose terms. It is established later that he is from a wealthy family, which is something that has never been delved into further. It's just been kind of mentioned of just, he comes from a wealthy family. Like, is there any details on the family? Is there any more in the back? No, we're not giving you anything more. That is it. That's all you need. We'll move on. Okay, cool.
I think because normally, but actually what would often happen is that you don't get any explanation. Whereas this happens a lot where you think, even like, from like Bullet onwards, there's all these policemen driving around in these cars that no policeman would ever be able to afford to drive. But at least in this, they do have a reason for him being able to do it. And I think that's probably because the whole point of this is that it's setting up the mismatched buddy cop in this is that one of them is wealthy and handsome and one is a family man. That's their two things. So I think it probably helps to establish a difference between the two of them.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's true. I think that's kind of the main differences between the two guys, and they kind of delve into that further, I guess. And like, I mean, there's a lot of convoluted hoops in this movie that it doesn't need to go through, but it does, and I guess we'll get into that further. But I think that it's quite impressive that of the things that it does kind of well. I think it is quite impressive that it establishes the characters quite so quickly, and like we kind of hit the ground running with both of these characters, and we know quite quickly who Mike Lowry is. We know quite quickly who Marcus Burnett is. He's a bit uptight. He's the one who's kind of he is. But the interesting thing I think is like as much as critics kind of bashed it for being generic and kind of following formula, the one way that I think it kind of flips the script is, even though they're co-leads, this is more Marcus's movie than it is Mike's. And that's because, and that's like, like one of the Lethal Weapons, Danny Glover being the main character, or like, or it being more about Nick Nolte than it is Eddie Murphy in the 48-hour movie. You know what I mean? So it kind of flips the dynamic where the wild card is not really the main character. It's the sensible quote unquote character who is more the main character.
Well, that's part of the thing with the movie. We'll probably get into it. But, I mean, for what will probably surprise people watching it now is the first two Bad Boys movies, Martin Lawrence is top billed over Will Smith. And one of the things about the plot of Bad Boys is Bad Boys, when it was... People would talk about it like it's a buddy cop movie. But Bad Boys in 1995 wasn't a franchise movie. It was a one-off movie that was about... or supposedly about, the premise behind it is that it's Marcus Burnett has to pretend to be Mike Lowry and that's sort of the whole point of it. So it was a kind of more of a high concept film. So it wasn't this idea that there'll be multiple Bad Boys films. The idea is it's this family man who has to, because of plot reasons, pretend to be this much cooler, handsome version. He has to be the cool, handsome cop, or pretend to be. That was the premise of the film, really, and it still plays out in the film. But I think because of watching it, and when I first watched it, like that would be how people describe it. That's the plot of this film. That's the plot of this film. And you watch it, that is ostensibly the plot, but the plot doesn't matter, and that's what I think turns it into a franchise. Is that what works best about the film is not the kind of plot mechanics. It's just that they are so good together on screen, and it's partly that establishes that plot twist is only to establish who they are. So to show almost to show who each character is by swapping them over, that gets to sort of like cement who they are. And it's those kind of characters that kind of plot device establishes is what kind of makes it into a franchise and what sort of changes the film by the end. So really, Tia Leone is sort of she is not really the love interest, although it's kind of suggested at the end she might become one. She's sort of like the third character in it. But I would imagine if I was her, even though she was in a big movie, she probably hasn't ended up being in the film she signed up for, because she isn't the third. She's very much by the end. She's just the woman. She's whereas it really cements who they are. So at the end of the film, you got there's Mike Lowry and Marcus Burnett, and they're the two bad boys. But I feel like the plot of it is almost suggesting that it should be like three co-leads, really. But it's not that. It doesn't really do that.
No.
And I wonder if it was like whatever the Dana Carvey, John Lovitz one, I wonder if that was much more pronounced. And by them almost throwing the script out, it was almost rewritten to be, because they were improvising so much, it ended up almost organically becoming this kind of Martin Lawrence, Will Smith show.
Yeah, I do wonder, because on both of those points, I do think you're right about the Tia Leone thing, and I kind of feel sorry for Tia Leone, because like when I first saw this when I was a kid, like. I just kind of I guess, like, because I was so into the banter between Martin Lawrence and Will Smith, like I kind of wrote the Tia Leone character off. I thought she was annoying, but now, like, watching it now, I kind of feel sorry for her, because I was like, oh, she is getting so little service that like, even if she was the best actor in the world, I don't think like she can make much out of this role. Like I kind of. Now, like, like rewatching it now, I'm like, no, she's just so underwritten, and she's, like she is it's basically wallpaper, of just to be around to give reactions to the bickering between Mike and Marcus, those two characters, and she's not even given like because at least. There's some other characters that they seem to like give enough material to, even though they're not on screen much, they give enough material to actually bounce off Mike and Marcus, like with the captain played by Joey Pantoliano. And maybe that's just because Joey Pants makes the best of everything, but I think they actually give him the material to kind of like and that's why that character became, part of the franchise and was a franchise character. I think. But yeah, and I mean, I guess it's not surprising. Michael Bay, doesn't have a good track record with female characters. Don Simpson and Jerry Bruckheimer don't have a good track record with female characters. So I guess it's not that surprising. But yeah, I kind of feel sorry for Tia Leone in this movie, to be honest.
Yeah, I think maybe I just wonder if perhaps in one version of the script she had more to do, or more.
Probably.
It felt like there was more, that when you think of that's the premise, and yet she doesn't have much to do with it, and yet she is the sort of anchor of that premise.
Yeah. And I guess, like, I don't know, like, how much, because I have to say, like I think maybe because I like Will Smith and Martin Lawrence, like I like and they improvised a lot, so I like their kind of banter. But I have to say, this is one of the few movies that has few Michael Bay movies that has comedy in it. That like I like, because like most of the time I think the humor, the sense of humor of a Michael Bay film is horrendous. I really think he has like a really mean spirited, like
Yeah.
just dumb like frat boy humor that I bounces off me. But and as much as like people might be raise an eyebrow because there is definitely a frat boyish side to this movie for sure. But I think it treads just the right side of the line for me most of the time.
I absolutely agree. Off the back of this, so part of the reason I wanted to do Bad Boys was my relationship with Bad Boys is I went to see Bad Boys at 15 and I thought Bad Boys was great. I saw it a few years ago. I still think it's great. I saw it for this and I was like, okay, I like it still. I still like it. It's not brilliant.
Yeah,
I've never liked Bad Boys 2.
I'm very much
I,
in the same boat.
and when it sort of became this sort of Bad Boys 2, I guess off the back of like Hot Fuzz and things, it's almost become this cult film where people talk about it and you go, well, actually, I'm like, well, no, Bad Boys 2 basically threw out Bad Boys. And I don't like, and Bad Boys 2 is one of the reasons I don't like it is it's completely different. And I watched it straight after watching Bad Boys because I was like, oh, I enjoyed Bad Boys enough to want to watch Bad Boys 2. And watching it again, having not liked it, I had this like, oh, maybe I need to give it another go. Kind of as well because of how much we might have time to get in this, we might not, of how much I love Bad Boys 3 and 4. I would now say that Bad Boys might be the third best Bad Boys movie because I love 3 and 4. I think 3 and 4 are fantastic. 2 I've never liked, and I went to revisit it off the back of how much I like 3 and 4 and how much I like the first one. I went, oh, maybe I need to give 2 another go. And it is pretty awful, I think. It doesn't work. And it's weird that that's the one that almost establishes it more because the sense of humor in particular is really, it's in very bad taste, but it's not a bad taste. It's particularly funny even. It's just like, it's incredibly mean spirited. It's not a nice film. Martin Lawrence isn't allowed to be funny anymore. I think partly that might be slightly Martin Lawrence's fault because he's not being funny. He's being like an action star. He too is wearing like the Will Smith vest. And it's like, you've just forgotten what this film was. So to me, it feels really weird that it sort of has that, almost people talk about it like, oh yeah, Bad Boys. But I don't know what they mean when they say that. To me, Bad Boys 2 is like, it's easily the worst of them. And it's got that has that where Michael Bay has become the almost cartoon Michael Bay with cameras zooming in and out of door locks and just for absolutely no reason going up a building. The camera flies up a building, then goes back down again. And you go, what was that for? It's there's no point to anything. So I much prefer Michael Bay as a Tony Scott ripoff. If he was the poor man's Tony Scott all his career, I'd probably quite like him.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think yeah, you're right. This hasn't got that bad taste humor. And like you say, it's like it is very frat boy and it's very childish. But this is a cut above that. This is I mean, it sounds silly to say, but it is a more adult's the wrong word. It's not an adult movie. It's but it's certainly in comparison, Bad Boys is a much more sophisticated movie to Bad Boys 2. And I realize what that sounds like, but it is. It's a much more sophisticated film.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I've not seen Bad Boys 4, so like I'll probably see it at some stage. I did enjoy Bad Boys for Life, and of the three that I've seen, I would say Bad Boys 2 is by far the worst. I also agree, because like as well as like the comedy just not working for me, and some of the comedy set pieces in that film, particularly when what is it, Marcus accidentally takes ecstasy or something, and like that scene drags on forever, like like there's like there like, and it's not it's not funny when it starts, and then it goes on and it goes on and it continues not being funny. And then also it just has like wild tonal shifts
Yes.
of just like, oh, we're doing like goofy comedy, and then like the next minute we're doing like borderline horror action of like somebody's being chopped up and put in a barrel, like what is going on?
There's a bit where they're pushing dead bodies, corpses out of the back of a van, and the
Yeah,
cars are running over these dead bodies where they're inadvertently knocking the heads off these dead bodies. And it's like, what film is this? And
yeah,
that's Michael Bay. That's his
yeah,
sense of humor. You can
yeah,
sort of
yeah,
tell that's him all over. The
yeah.
bit in Bad Boys 2 that works best is the bit they put in all the trailers and things, which is the essentially like the comedy bit where you've got this guy Reggie who's who's like a 15-year-old kid who's about to take Martin Lawrence's daughter out on her first date,
Oh yeah,
and
yeah,
they
yeah.
do the thing at the door, and that's a really funny bit, but it's much broader than any comedy and anything else, but it really works in that film, and it's by far the best scene in the whole film, and it's
Yeah.
not an action thing, it's just the two of them improvising, and I think that's what you get a lot of in the first one. And in the second one, it just doesn't feel like they particularly want to be funny. They're kind of funny, but in a snarky way, but they're
Yeah.
not funny like they
That
are in Bad Boys.
that I mean that's true. And like yeah, there's very few things in Bad Boys 2 that works for me. One of the things it does is like I do think it's quite funny like towards what you think is the end of the movie. Where like they have that big car chase in Miami, and like Will Smith steals Dan Marino's car, and like that's like
Yes.
that's quite funny. But then like that's a pain in the ass as well, because like you have that big car chase, which very much feels like the end of the movie, and then they go to Cuba, and there's like another like 50 fucking minutes. Like
Mm.
anyway, enough ranting about Bad Boys 2, I guess. But like no, you're right in comparison. Like, and I think you're right about the Martin Lawrence, the Marcus Burnett character, where like he just stops being funny. Like he and he's much more kind of like I'm the cool action star. Whereas in this movie, like some of the bits in this movie that I really enjoy is when he's being at his goofiest, like when he's like being like just rubbish at like boxing and stuff in the gym, and like
Yeah.
just lifting the weights and failing hard, and stuff like that. All this, like, that's kind of Martin Lawrence at his best. Like that's kind of
Yeah.
what he's best at, like doing that kind of goofball humor.
And I think he works it because he is good and he is kind of good at the action stuff. You've got the scene where they go to the club
Mm.
and it's like Martin Lawrence saying, "Don't get distracted," and the Will Smith character is completely distracted by the kind of dancing girls who are there,
Yeah.
and it ends up with the scene where you get the two heavies that approach Martin Lawrence in the toilet to beat him up, and at that point he does have that thing where he is good at being a cop a cop in the bad boy sense of being a cop. He's a good bad boy. He's not a pushover.
Yeah.
But he's not a family man who's rubbish. It's not like Lethal Weapon where he's just running around after Will Smith. They are both good at that stuff.
Hmm.
And I don't mind that so much, but it is that thing that he's got a slightly different perspective. He's the family man. That's the difference. So in scenes like that, he can be the action star and also be funny. That they make that scene funny by being this idea that he's trying to get Will Smith's attention while he's about to be beaten up by these two heavies.
Yeah.
So you've got that thing where he is a much more comic character, whereas the Will Smith character, certainly in the first one, although they're funny together,
Hmm.
when he's on his own, he's the kind of smooth, good-looking, essentially what would be the leading man in any other film. But he's got Martin Lawrence, and it does feel like they are co-leads, and Martin Lawrence is allowed to be funny. But a scene like that shows him being funny whilst also being an action lead. He's in a big sort of gunfight in a toilet. Well, actually, it's sort of a fist fight, isn't it? 'Cause he keeps getting they all keep getting their guns sort of flying
out of their
around the
hands.
toilet. Yeah, knocked
Yeah.
out their hands and sliding along the toilet floor, where each of them are trying to pick up guns. And they occasionally have guns, but essentially, it's this sort of action style, essentially like a fist fight, really, with the occasional gun thrown in. But that's him being. He isn't in that situation. He isn't a pushover. He isn't getting beaten up. He is handling himself whilst also being funny. And that to me is the strength. That's where that character works best. And that is the thing where he isn't a pushover. And that might have been a Martin Lawrence thing in the first one where he didn't want to be the comic relief. He wanted to be the co-lead. He's the, he's top billing. He still wants to be able to do that stuff. But in the second one, he's forgotten to be funny entirely. He's just trying to be the same as Will Smith, but he's got a wife and kids, and it's like it's not it. That's not the formula.
Yeah, that's true. And even though I think that like all the action sequences in that movie are very much like, like we're trying to be cool. Everything's
Yeah.
cool, man. And like whereas like you say, like that's a good example of how the films differentiate, because like that, that fight in the Club Hell bathroom, like even though there's no martial arts involved, it's more akin to like a Jackie Chan fight, and like that's what Jackie Chan's like in the kind of
Yes.
police story movies, where he's a competent fighter, but he's also a bit of a goof. So you get this
Yeah.
mixture of like doing well, but also having to use the environment to kind of help him out, kind of thing, and
Yeah.
and like so, and it uses that the mixture of comedy and action, and it perfectly balances it out. And so I think like that's what I kind of relate it to, like that kind of fight. And and I think that's kind of where that character should be. He's competent, he can fight, but he's also a bit of a goof, and like maybe he needs certain things to kind of help him out, and a bit of luck, and that kind of thing.
Yes. And also, I'd say one of the things that's really striking about this film is almost that they do end up, for cops and essentially people who are good guys, the one things that feel slightly dated is the amount of people by the end of the film that they have killed. They've killed. They think, I mean, how many people have they just killed? And that makes it sort of funnier that there's this idea that Martin Lawrence is just this family man, where you go, he just goes back to his kids. He's just a regular Joe. And it's almost like, how many people have you killed today, Martin? It's like, oh, about, 35, 40. It's a very casually killing.
That's true.
Sort of things.
I mean, I guess that's true, but I guess like like there's like a kind of there's a weird moral scale where like Marcus kind of like devalues his killing, because he's like, well, I've killed maybe like 12 people today, but Mike over there has killed 35. So
Yes.
like, so in the moral column, I'm doing okay, I guess. I guess like that's one of the things. I mean, I guess if you are a viewer of these types of movies, and you are of a liberal or kind of left wing political bent, I guess that's the kind of things you just have to kind of
for sure.
kind of manage in your head, of being like, because like this movie very much does the thing that all these movies does, where like all these movies have like a character who is either a human rights lawyer or an internal affairs person, which in this case it's an internal affairs person, that like generally in real life you would you as a liberal would be on the side of, but in the movie you're like, fuck that person, they're scum. let them ruin Miami as they want to get the bad guys.
We don't need these pen pushers. We need to go out and sort it. But yeah, that's very much the case here. But and they're likable. They're very likable.
Yeah,
that is the thing now. Even the thing of I'm zooming ahead back to the fourth movie. I had that thing where you go, I don't even know if I like Will Smith anymore. Like, I mean, after he sort of punches Chris Rock at the Oscars, I went, I don't know if this is the guy. And I would say, like, Will Smith is charming enough that within like 30 seconds of the latest Bad Boys movie, I went, I don't care. He's just charming. He's like a.
It depends. Yeah, it depends what. I guess it depends what movies. Because I very much feel the same way. I was a huge Will Smith fan in the '90s and in the 2000s, but started to go off him kind of in the early 2010s when it started to come out. He was, he was in Scientology, and then he had those like vanity projects with his son, and then obviously the latest thing with like the slap and all that. So, but then yeah, as soon as I watch one of these films, one of his classics like this, or Men in Black or Independence Day or whatever, I'm like, God, he's charming. You know, like
He's pure charisma. I think that's what he was like. That's the guy from Fresh Prince. Is
yeah.
that he's pure charisma. It's really hard not to like him.
Yeah, it is yeah, it's very difficult. It's very difficult. And
It kind of makes him perfectly cast as well as as Mike Lowry. That's another thing I'd say about these movies,
uh-huh,
that they are, for me, maybe it's just the generation I was or the age I was,
uh-huh.
but it is something that, considering they've done 4 movies at a span of essentially 30 years,
Yeah.
they've got, like, Marcus Burnett and Mike Lowry still feel like I know who they are. Like, if someone's like talks about Bad Boys, my brain says, "Oh yeah, Will Smith, Martin Lawrence," but it also says, "Oh yeah, Marcus Burnett and Mike Lowry." It's what you do know those names in the way that I guess like what characters like that kind of stay. I'm trying to think of other ones that really have stood the test of time, I guess.
Other one, yeah. I mean, I guess there's a few. I mean, I guess like, and obviously in this kind of genre of cop action movies, so John McClane,
Yeah, yeah,
like I would say, as much as obviously he's a horrible person, when I hear Mel Gibson, I still think of Mad Max, and
yeah,
Riggs, I guess,
yeah,
so he's
yeah.
he's, he's got two. Yeah, there is certain ones like that kind of that stand the test of time, for a long time. But you're right. I think there is certain characters that you're like, because and because you're right about, when I think of Bad Boys, I don't just think Will Smith and Martin Lawrence. I think about the characters, and there's certain other action movies like that, like mention like the John McClane thing as well. But yeah, I guess there's other action franchises where I don't know if I do think about the character. Like, for
Yeah.
as much as I love the Mission Impossible movies, I just think Tom Cruise is Tom Cruise. Tom Cruise is Tom Cruise, and like I don't necessarily think like Ethan Hunt is like not like a incredibly defined character. I don't feel he's
Yeah.
just Tom Cruise. Like,
Yeah.
maybe that's controversial. Maybe all the Mission Impossible fans are coming after me now. But I do love
I
the
don't know.
Mission Impossible films, but
Oh, I do. I do. Yeah, I don't know. I just think for something that doesn't feel like Bad Boys, I guess, is a big franchise, but it almost doesn't feel like it's such a big I don't know. It just sort of feels like it's almost that, should we know those names? Should those names
I
come
guess
so easily to us?
I guess not, because it's a weird franchise. It's not
Yeah.
like it's spread out over such a length of time, and like even though something like Mission Impossible, like that's kind of strung out over a number of years, but usually there's maybe like 4 or 5 years, or 4, 5, 6 years between each movie, like whatever. So it's still quite close, but like it's so random, the Bad Boys franchise. It's like what is it? There's like 9 years between the first and second one, or no, eight, because I think it's
8 years,
2003. So
2003, isn't it?
the
Then,
2003.
then another 17 years.
Yeah, yeah. So there's eight, and then 17, and then there's only like what is it, like
4.
four, because
Yeah.
it's 2020. So 8, 17, and 4. So like it's so random. It's not like a franchise that, like, particularly like the horror franchises, where it's like, like Saw and like
Yeah.
Friday the 13th, where you just got one sequel after another, like almost yearly. So I guess it doesn't feel like a franchise in that sense, because it's just so sporadic and so kind of
Yeah.
random. But yeah, so maybe it is surprising that the characters are so kind of bedded in, given that we've got like these sporadic sequels, and like when they made the third one, I was like, what? Like I was very good, but then I actually watched it and I was like, this is pretty good.
It's really good. It's really good.
I actually enjoyed it, and yeah, and I guess, like, with these, we've kind of talked about this sort of thing before, where it's difficult like there's certain movies we covered like Mission Impossible and like the Bond films and the Batman films of the 90s, and it is difficult to kind of talk about any of these films in a vacuum and just talk about the
Mm.
film itself and not talk about like what came after or what came before, that kind of thing.
I think both things are interesting with this, though.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think
yeah,
it's interesting to look at it as a standalone film, and
yeah,
it's also interesting to think of like what became of it and how it kind of evolved and or devolved, and then
yeah.
what I would say is now almost at its perfect version of
Perfect,
itself.
perfect level. And I guess like it's very interesting because of how different, like where they both were in terms of their career. Because
Yes, yeah,
neither of them had like big movie hits or anything, and they would both go on to big movie hits. And then, I mean, there was a certain period in the mid to late 2000s where Will Smith was arguably the biggest movie star in the world.
oh
Um,
for sure, yeah,
like, and there's loads, there's movies in that period, particularly, from about 2004 to the end of the 2000s, that like he had he had films that were mega hits that now nobody remembers, that were just mega hits
mm.
purely based on his name. Like, I don't think that there's lots of people, maybe there is, but I don't think there's lots of people like kind of rewatching iRobot
No,
or particularly something like a Hancock, which is totally forgotten now, but was one of the top five biggest films in 2008. Even though it's like, you mention Hancock to people, you'd be like, "What the fuck is Hancock?" And it's like, it's this kind of weird, kind of superhero parody thing that then kind of became this kind of tragic romance. It's a very strange film, but anyway, people went to see it because Will Smith was in
yeah,
it.
yeah.
you know,
That's it. Yeah, he was massive. Hitch. Yeah. One.
exactly,
I
exactly.
struggle to think of many of them for a long time that
Yeah,
didn't hit, and a lot of them aren't very good.
that's
But
true.
like,
But they were
such was the
massive.
power of
Yeah,
such was the
yeah.
power of the charm and charisma of Will Smith that it was kind of unstoppable for a long time.
Yeah, for a while, he was just like you say, he was just kind of unstoppable. And like you say, a lot of them, like iRobot, Hitch isn't great. I Am Legends, not a particularly good adaptation of that
Yeah,
novel. But Hancock, but they were all massive. They were all
yeah.
massive, and it
He
was just
has weirdly he hasn't made that many good films,
no,
and yet he is dictionary definition movie star. He
yeah.
is an absolute movie star, and that's the power of it. People like watching him.
Yeah, he did have a great beginning though, because when you look at that run of like Bad Boys, Independence Day, Men in Black, Enemy of the State, obviously that run
Yeah,
is spoilt then by Wild Wild West. But those four films, that's a pretty great
mm,
run right there.
yeah,
You
yeah.
know? Yeah. I
Really
think
great.
I think that probably made the foundation of like his movie career. Of like those are
Oh yeah,
four really cracking films, that all of which still have a reputation today. I guess like Enemy of the States maybe not as known by people now, but it's a really great film, and like it
mm,
should be more well known than it is actually, to be honest. But particularly those first three, Bad Boys, Independence Day, and Men in Black, are still massive films in the pop culture now, almost like 30 years later.
yeah, for sure, for sure.
Yeah.
And I think maybe it's when there's a sort of wax and waning. I think it's because he was so busy in between. I think there was probably desperate for a sequel for Men in Black for Bad Boys for straight after it. Probably took 8 years
Yeah,
before his
probably.
kind of calendar freed up. Probably he was that busy.
Yeah.
Whereas like Martin Lawrence was very much like he had a big career post Bad Boys, but it was very much in the broad comedy world. It wasn't like it established him as like an action star. Is
Yeah.
there another? Are there other Martin Lawrence action movies in that
There,
vein? I'm trying to think.
there is one that's similar. There is a kind of cop action comedy called Blue Streak that came out,
There is, yeah, yeah,
and I think about 99, and that's the only other. But then like once you get into the 2000s, it's like Big Mama's House and that kind of stuff. But like Blue Streak is the only one that I can think of off the top of my head that's similar. He's also in it's kind of more action adjacent, but he's also in a kind of buddy comedy a couple of years after this called Nothing to Lose with Tim Robbins.
Tim Robbins, yeah. I
Um,
did. I saw that, yeah.
where he's like a kind of thief and kind of attempts to carjack Tim Robbins and there's a bit of action in that. I wouldn't strictly call it an action comedy. It's more of a comedy
No.
with a couple of action set pieces. But I think Blue Streak is the closest to this. Outside of the Bad Boys franchise, I think that Blue Streak is probably the closest. But I don't think he never really established himself as like a kind of action guy.
Yeah, and you'd almost think that would have been his. I mean, out of all of them, I guess Big Mama's House was a big hit, and he had a handful of big movies. But even by the time of Bad Boys 2, I think there's something that I always liked about. Maybe it was contractual, but I still always liked that he gets top billing in Bad Boys 2. When at the time it felt like, no way,
no
way.
It does seem ridiculous because, like, as much as I mean, like, it's a bad movie and it got terrible reviews, but Big Mama's House was a really big hit. But still, Martin Lawrence by that stage, even though he'd had a couple of big hits in the early 2000s, Will Smith was right on the precipice of becoming the biggest movie star in the world, and like Martin Lawrence didn't feel anywhere near that. So for him to get top billing in that film does seem nuts.
Yeah. By the third, it switched around, and that is only fair, I think. But
absolutely. So I guess, like, going back to the first Bad Boys, this one, we should maybe like go through kind of some of the strengths and weaknesses of the movie, and like kind of watching this time, and it's something that I kind of thought about like the last couple of times, because a couple of times I watched it, was that I feel like one of the weaknesses, and like you say, I think that like you should ignore the plot. The plot doesn't matter really. It's the character dynamics that matter, and I think that's fair enough. I don't think that's a major problem, but I do think one of the things that kind of lets the movie down is that Fouché is not a great villain. Like, in a lot of these things, you look at like a lot of these types of movies, like the original Beverly Hills Cop, you got like Steven Berkoff is like a cool villain. You've got Joss Ackland in Lethal Weapon. You've got like obviously the classic Hans Gruber, Alan Rickman in Die Hard, and you got these like classic villains. And I think like for me, a lot of the best action movies, it's a lot of the best action movies, a lot of what makes the best action movies great action movies is, apart from the action, is villains. You got to have a great villain along with your great hero. And I just think, as much as the actor does an okay job, I just think that Fouché is just an underwritten, poor villain.
No, I do agree. And I like the actor, and it feels like he just hasn't got a lot to work with. There's so much that happens in it, which I think is a sort of... I think something happened to this film, which I kind of mentioned before, whereas I think because I think it was a much tighter screenplay than when Michael Bay got his hands on it and turned it into Will Smith and Martin Lawrence improving, which I think the upside of that is we get this... I think it's made the film much funnier and probably much more memorable than it ever would have been otherwise. But I do think what it sacrifices to do that is that Michael Bay isn't remotely interested in any of the plot mechanics. Exactly what I was saying about Téa Leoni. It's basically, it is a concept. That is the concept of the film. They don't really do it. They don't play the concept. And similarly with the villain, you have all this kind of plot stuff in the first kind of 20 minutes or so, which feels like it should be a bigger payoff. So you have this thing that the plot of the film is basically there is this $100 million of drugs that have gone missing, and there's a dirty cop that works with them, and that's how it starts. That's the sort of on paper, the sort of plot mechanics, the story of it are much more straightforward and are quite a good plot mechanic for any other action film. It's just in this one they're just not interested in it. So you have the thing where you have the dirty cop who is revealed within 20 minutes and then killed.
Yeah.
So he's almost set up to be the villain. He's the sort of, he's a guy, he's an ex-cop. He probably knows Will Smith and Martin Lawrence, and that's almost thing that it's a dirty cop, and then that guy's dispatched. That feels like it should have been a moment in anyone else's film that he's the guy who's killed, and it's almost kind of thrown away that by the time he's killed, you've got to go, who is he again? Oh, he's the guy, he's the cop. So when he's killed, it's kind of thrown away. So, and when it has the villain, again, it doesn't, like you say, he's very underdeveloped. And at the end, there's such a payoff for him being killed, and this kind of, he's shot in the leg by Will Smith, and there's a decision, we mustn't kill him, we're going to arrest him. And then he does. And that feels like it's supposed to feel like a moment. And it doesn't really, because we don't care that much. It's just like, it feels like they've almost got like, but at the end, it's almost like they've got this real, that there's the vendetta that he has because he's also killed Mike Lowry's ex, Max, and it's a revenge killing. But it's sort of, by the end, it's kind of a bit like, you have to go, oh, right, yeah, that's why it's personal. It doesn't feel like that in any other film. The idea that the villain has essentially killed the ex, there's still like an old flame, but there's still a flame there with one of the main characters, feels like that dynamic would be going all the way through. There would be this sort of fury and anger and this desire for revenge. And he sort of talked out of the revenge at the end, like, no, we're gonna take him in. We're not gonna kill him. We're not gonna execute him like we have these 30 other people this afternoon. We're gonna take this guy in for justice. But when it happens, it doesn't really feel that big a deal. It's almost like for most of the movie, like for the 5 minutes after Max is shot and they find the body, there's a bit of despair of Mike Lowry. But then they kind of forget that it's sort of a revenge plot until the last 5 minutes. So when there is this thing where it feels like it's suddenly high tension drama about whether or not he's going to kill this guy, as an audience member, you have to kind of remind yourself and go, oh yeah, because he killed his ex. And it's like, I mean, but none of the rest of the film is concerned with that at all. It's like they just remember at the end that it's a revenge plot.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right, because, and I think like the why it doesn't work is exactly what you're saying, is like it's given no emotional weight, and like Mike Lowry's character doesn't change the rest of the movie. Like basically, like you said, Mike Lowry kind of walks away from the crime scene, is incredibly upset, has like one bad night where, and this is how the plot mechanics of like why Mike Lowry is not available and why Marcus has to pretend to be Mike Lowry, is because he goes down, to track down the madam, because his ex Max was a escort, and like he goes, and then he gets beaten up and thrown through a window, and then he has to spend a night in hospital, and then is discharged the next day, and so he is incommunicado for the period that Tio Leone's character phones up, and that's why Marcus has to pretend to be Mike. But other than that, like one bad night, where he gets thrown through the window, and he's a bit distressed, and he's a man on the rampage and a man looking for vengeance. Like the next day, like immediately the character resets into banter mode with Marcus, and like is in banter mode for the rest of the movie up until that final sequence that you're talking about right there, where he has to make a moral decision whether to execute the villain or not execute the villain, which he ends up doing because he nearly kills Marcus, and he has to kill him in the end anyway. But yeah, I think like, I guess like that's another kind of weakness in the movie, that like it's good at being fun, but it's not good at like any sort of like emotional stake or any kind of like, oh, we kind of care about things. Well, like, like we kind of care about these characters, and kind of like have like a kind of emotional connection to many of the beyond the central two characters. Where like, oh, we kind of care whether they live or die, but like we kind of the rest of the cast, I don't know. Like so, there's not, and again, I guess like that's a weakness that is common in Michael Bay films. Like it's not, they don't generally have strong emotional stakes. I don't think that's something he is
Yeah.
known for generally. Um,
I don't think they're. I mean, it'd be interesting to know what the script was like, but it does feel like you can see the other film that it would have been. You can see what there's a version of the script where it's a straight kind of revenge plot with the plot mechanic of one of them has to be the other one. That you can totally see what that film is. But then when it becomes Will Smith and Martin Lawrence, and I guess Michael Bay, it does become a totally different film. And it's to some extent, I mean, watching it, you feel that because Max, the escort who's killed, who's the ex of Will Smith, is also the best friend of Tia Leone, and she goes through periods of the film where sometimes she's grief stricken, and other times she's kind of. And you do think this takes place over like a few days. Yeah. It's not like, and you go, well, maybe she's in shock. But there's lots of bits in the film where she is just more fed up with Martin Lawrence than she is that her best mate has been killed. There's just that kind of. But I mean, I understand that's how these films work, and you just and to the point where it's only because I'm examining it now that these things kind of for a second while watching it kind of irritate you or you notice them, but it's fun enough that it barrels along that it's kind of like whatever, that happened. There's lots of things like that. Like I was saying, the amount of people that get killed, the thing at the end where he's about to where he's about to execute the bad guy. It's all this stuff where when I'm watching it, it's like, well, that's what's going on. Why is this a big deal? But you just it barrels along at such a pace that I think I care less. My brain's like, okay, it still works because it's still. Yeah. I'm still having a good time. I'm not. It's like if it was boring or it wasn't funny or entertaining, these things would stand out a lot more and be like, oh, that's terrible.
Yeah. So I know what you mean. I know what you mean. Like there's certain things that like if you're on a podcast or even if you're having like a discussion with somebody after a movie and you might analyze things to a greater degree than when you're necessarily watching them. And I think like yeah, there is a certain point where it's like, does it matter as long as you're being entertained? And like, I was entertained throughout. Like I've watched this movie many times. I owned it on VHS, so that was, like, so I've watched it several times, and I am entertained. And like, yeah, yeah. I mean, like, these are flaws within it, but like, Martin Lawrence and Will Smith paper over a lot of the flaws.
Oh yeah,
and I think yeah, you could definitely see different versions of this movie. Like you say, there is like a more serious take on the movie where Mike really becomes like a man on the warpath from like Act 2 onwards. Or there's like a kind of slightly more. I can imagine like the John Lovett's Dana Carvey being like slightly more comedic, and like you saying, having the Tia Leone character is slightly more of like a kind of third co-lead, and there being much more kind of comedy hijinks of like trying to hide the identity and playing the comedic states of that up much more. So there is many different versions of the film that you could that you could see, you could picture. I don't know. I mean, like as the film is structured, like looking back on it, like I think the opening scene is great. The villain heist scene that they do the heist in the police station, that's really effectively done. And I think that whole opening kind of 20 minutes or so, or that kind of first act, I think is done really well. And I do think that like the action that you get in the third act is done really well. But I don't know, as funny as some of the bits are, and I think like, Martin Lawrence and Will Smith power you through it. Like that second act where we're doing the kind of the identity thing, of like the switched identity. I think some of that kind of drags. Like, because it feels so convoluted and there's so many opportunities for them to just kind of iron it out and be like, yeah, I just did that on that one night because I had no choice, but this is the real Mike. Like it feels so easily resolved that like you just feel like, why are we still doing this? Or certainly on this watch, I kind of felt that a bit.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, that's what I mean. I don't think that bit. The film is not remotely interested in the plot of that. Whereas I think I think if there was a John Lovett's Dana Carvey thing, that would be the whole film. The whole film is them mismatched. Whereas a kind of in the John Lovett's Dana Carvey version, the idea of one of them being on this revenge plot, I can't picture it at all.
Oh,
That
true.
feels like that's another, but that side of it I don't get. Whereas I think in this one it's so, yeah, it doesn't really work, and yet it almost like it has to be in the film. I remember when people discuss it, if you like, or it was being talked about at the time, people would talk about it like that was the plot of the film, and you go, I get it, but it isn't, because it's not interested in it. That's the plot of the film. It's like that middle section is only there to basically go, oh yeah, because it says in the blurb that this is what happens. So we actually have to do that in the movie. If you read the back of the video box, that's what it says it's about. So we've got to do that bit. But it's like it's just not interested in its own plot. And it just wants to get on with it. It's like, yeah, like you say, you've got the first section, which is straight out of like a Beverly Hills Cop 2 or something, isn't it? The kind of heist on the, and it's great. Whereas this is, and yeah, the end bit is the kind of resolve of the revenge thing. But it's, yeah, the middle bit, it's kind of good for comedy, but it's very, it's sort of light, and you can kind of see all the bits happening. I mean, there are nice bits. I like the guy who's the concierge at the block of flats. I like all that stuff. Works quite well.
Yeah, the chat stuff is funny. Yeah, yeah.
So it has its moments, but yeah, like you say, it does feel like the kind of thing where there's a much easier non-movie version of how this could be resolved in quite a satisfying way, but it would be boring. I mean, I guess they've gone for the most kind of what's the biggest. I like the bit where Will Smith's on the phone to Martin Lawrence's wife, and she hangs up, and he keeps talking about what are you wearing, and he's trying to wind up. Well, that stuff's really fun. So that's like it's got fun moments, but that's what they're extracting is. It's like, what's the comedy we can get out of this situation? What can we get from these characters doing it? And the person who really suffers is Tia Leone, who's just like. She's like wallpaper in it, where it feels like she's kind of the anchor. She should be the anchor of the plot, really, and isn't. No. And I'm sure probably signed up for a film that was like, I'm like the third lead in this, but never feels like she is.
Not even close. But like you say, there is some fun moments in it. I like you. I enjoy the chat stuff, and also like just before, yeah, when they go to like Mike's apartment and Mike realizes that like the dog has been like shitting on the carpet and stuff like that, and he's like, "Oh, it's so forgiving of you, that you could just if it was me, I would be mad, but you like you, oh wow, like that stuff, like that's really funny." Yeah. So there's definitely some of it that kind of works, even though it's too convoluted for its own good, to be honest.
I mean, the things where like there's the jokes about Tia Leone thinking Martin Lawrence is gay feel dated, but actually in the context of the film is a good gag, really. And it's funny that she's saying it because in his flat he has lots of photos of Will Smith, and when you see the sort of sideboard where it's just, and it's even funny that Will Smith has so many photos of himself in his own flat is kind of funny, and has that thing of, oh right, well he's almost so kind of in love with himself that he has photos of himself. But if another man is living in this flat that has these photos,
Yeah.
you could see how you'd reach that conclusion.
I think like yeah. I think like part that seems like a funny scene because like I think part of that scene's hilarious because like you say it's hilarious that Mike has all these photos of himself because it kind of shows him up to be quite narcissistic, and then it's hilarious like Marcus kind of spinning his wheels trying to find an excuse, and it's like the whole thing about like, yeah, I get a new picture of him every time I save his life. Like that's hilarious.
Yeah.
But then when it gets to like when Tina Leone's like, oh, I thought this was pictures of your lover. I think like when he starts being like kind of like, no, doing the kind of
Yeah.
uber kind of manly kind of no homo, like, no, I fuck, like that. That's kind of like, yeah, no, right, okay, I guess it's the 90s.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Very much so.
I found part of that scene hilarious, and I still find part of that scene hilarious. But there's part of that scene that I'm like, yeah, I could do without that.
There's a weird thing about it, which I feel again is probably lost somewhere in the kind of improving, that it feels almost from the start that Tia Leone seems like her character is smart.
Yeah.
And it almost feels like the whole way along she kind of knows, but it's never revealed whether she actually knows.
Yeah,
It's kind of like it's such an odd. The dynamic of it's really odd. So she's not playing dumb at all. It's not like, oh, I'm totally everything you're saying I'm buying. She's questions everything, and it almost feels like in some ways that she is sort of dragging it out further than it needs to because she's partly winding him up, that she's figured this out. And at the end, it kind of suggests that that's probably the case. But there are bits where it feels like you're not certain as an audience member whether she does know or not. Even when Martin Lawrence's wife turns up, there is this sense of she does that thing. Oh, which one's he, the big one or the little one? And it's like, so you do know, but it's never really explicit at what point she does know and doesn't know.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's true. Like I don't know. There is like the way they play it is interesting, and I think the way they play it is actually part of the reason it kind of doesn't work as a plot. Because either I guess you make the character more dim and like just buy into it, or you resolve it quicker and you're like and the character calls them out directly. But they do it in this kind of weird way where there's these moments where it seems like, oh no, Tina only believes that Marcus is Mike. But then they do have these other moments, like the moment where she quote unquote tries to seduce him, where it seems like very clear that she knows that Marcus is Marcus and Mike is Mike.
Yeah.
Like so, but they never make it explicit.
No,
it's kind of frustrating.
it is, and it that's another thing. It just again feels like that's probably a thing where she is wanting to say my character should be really smart and he really knows what's happening, and it's like Michael Bay's gone, yeah, go with that you actually know, whereas the two cops are pretending that it's like they're playing it like she's stupid. And the bit where he's in the car and they have the car chase and she says, oh, there's like a baby seat in here, and he goes, oh yeah, well, I'm deep undercover. You think all that stuff feels like they're playing it as if it's like that they've got something over on her.
Yeah.
Whereas it feels like, but that isn't it. She must know. And she is winding you up. Like, yeah, the seduction scene is like, she's winding you up. But it's never explicit that she does know. Whereas it feels almost like, I don't know, like I think she's so underserved in this that it feels like it's a bit of a shame because she's obviously got something or she's playing it a certain way and they're playing it against the way she's playing it almost.
Yes, and I think that's what causes that friction of like you say, they're both Will Smith and Martin Lawrence are playing it as if she's completely hoodwinked, and she's playing it as if she has been onto it almost from the beginning.
Yeah,
and like that doesn't mesh. Like, so
Yes.
it gives a weird viewing experience.
It's so it's partly interesting, and her at the end of the film, you are left with this thing where again you have this what's supposed to happen in another similar script doesn't happen, where it has a bit at the end where Martin Lawrence's character is so sort of wound up, and he's like, right, well, I'm going home. I've been shot. I'm going home. And he says, oh yeah, well, you wanted Mike Lowry. This is Mike Lowry, and he handcuffs them together, and it sort of suggests that this will be a kind of romance plot. But any kind of romance subplot, they forgot about.
Yeah.
They're not interested. There's not been one. So they do this thing like that's who you're looking for, and it suggests that that's it now. They're now in any other film they would become a couple, but it's not. They're sort of handcuffed together in this way where they're like, oh, hold on. It's so like you haven't done that. Yeah. It's like it happens at the film. It's like the film ends and they realize they haven't set up any of this subplot that would be in any other version of this film. There would be a sort of will they, won't they thing. Will she figure it out? She kind of, but again, the seduction scene suggests that she kind of does like Martin Lawrence, or she's joking, or she likes the kind of idea of the idea of Mike Lowry has been sold to her so well that she's totally she's in love with the idea of the Mike Lowry that's been explained to her.
Because like it seems like in the very brief time we get to her that the Max character is besotted with Mike Lowry, and thinks that like one day he'll realize and they'll get together and live happily ever after, kind of thing. So she seems like she's really besotted by him, and has obviously imparted that to the Tia Leone character. So yeah, you might be right that like she's intoxicated by what the idea of Mike Lowry that Max has given her, for sure. But I would suggest that like I'm not sure about this, but I almost feel like the way these movies are structured, having seen 3 of the 4 Bad Boy movies, I feel like there's almost, because like the whole point of the movies is so heavily predicated on the banter between Marcus and Mike, there's almost no room for romance because they're basically married to each other.
Totally. It's not really. I mean, I think it does quite a good job, and the later ones do certainly, in making the family much more important. And you get that a bit in this.
Yeah.
But there's no room for anyone else. There's no room for anyone else. And I think that's it. It becomes totally about them, and they love each other, but they kind of argue. There's always this thing as well, again, which sort of is always a bit like it kind of works, where both of them are sort of half scared of each other. If one of them does something to piss the other one off, the other one's kind of, oh, he's gonna come for me. But then it goes both ways. Yeah. So Will Smith is at times frightened that Martin Lawrence will come for him, and equally, Martin Lawrence is scared at times that Will Smith will come for it if he finds out about plot point, whatever. So they've got this thing where they're quite even in terms of their sort of status and their kind of, I guess, their kind of toughness or whatever. That both of them are kind of a bit scared of each other coming after them, but they're not. But again, that's even in all the films is always a bit like, but is it your friends? You're not actually going to get into an actual fight. No, because you're your best mate. But there is this sort of, he'll be after me if he finds out about this or that.
And it is quite funny that how the dynamics kind of constantly shift of like, because like Mike Lowry is often played as kind of cool ladies man action, kind of Mike Lowry, and like particularly in like that gym scene, he's like super cool character, and he's like talking to Max and like being all cool in the gym while Marcus is making a tit of himself. But then there's other scenes where it completely flips the script, where like for example when Marcus has to pretend that he's leaving for Cleveland and he's having an argument with his wife, then Mike is almost acting like child while mummy and daddy argue. Kind of like it's really interesting how they constantly switch from being action to goof to, you know, like that kind of
and
stuff.
that stuff's great. Like everything with Will Smith and Martin Lawrence is great.
Sure, absolutely.
It's just everything else. Like that's a great idea. And that's really like, if that was scripted, it'd be like, what a great bit of screenwriting that there is this shifting dynamic between them all the time, and it totally works. It's everyone else who gets dragged into it that's sort of forgotten about, because what's most important is what's happening between them, and that's why I guess that's the franchise. The franchise is those two. It's not like Tia Leone shows up in Bad Boys 2. There's no space for her. It's always that. But that is really good. Also, I think one of the things that's quite interesting about it, that for a 90s film that you think could be maybe a bit more sexist, or is that one of the things that's quite nice about it is the Martin Lawrence character is obviously a choice they've decided on. He's not really jealous of the womanizing Will Smith character. At no point is he really like, oh, I wish I was him and not married. You kind of get the impression that as much as he is like, he doesn't get any sleep. He's got all these kids. He doesn't get to have sex with his wife. All these kind of family matters. You do always get the impression that that is who he is and wants to be. He's not wanting to be the Will Smith character at all. He's not jealous of him seeing all these women in a way that you could also imagine there's another version of the film where he's the kind of, oh, I've really made a mistake and her indoors. You do get the impression he loves his sort of family life as well.
No, it's really like, the sexual politics of this film is really quite interesting because, like you say, I totally agree with that. You get the impression that like Marcus wants to have Marcus's life. You get the impression that like very much he thinks his wife is the most gorgeous woman, that he doesn't want anybody else. He is totally in love with her, and that's very cool. And it feels like, there could have been, like you say, it could have been another version of this movie where he wanted to be the ladies' man, and like and it's kind of a lot of kind of the ball and chain type jokes. I do think that there is another side to the movie, particularly when Marcus throws out the woman who comes in her underwear, where there is a certain element of bitches be crazy type humor, like that. It feels quite dated. So there is a little bit of progressiveness, but then there's a little bit of retrogradeness as well.
It's weird what that's that, because it's almost that we've sort of had two sort of generations since then, and there are bits of it where you think you've also got the character of Max, who's an escort, who's an ex of, and you go, in some ways you think that's quite progressive, and it's also retrogressive. It's like you've got this sort of push and pull, and the Tia Leone character is her mate and isn't judgmental about there's nothing judgmental about her being a sex worker or anything. It's all just like that. And Will Smith and Tia Leone both seem to think that doesn't seem to be a factor in their relationship with her at all. So that stuff seems quite modern, and yet there is also this thing where you could also say, but she's also the hooker with a heart of gold, and she's also that character. She's a real trope as well. So it's kind of, it feels almost that even 10 years ago you might have gone, oh, that's dated badly, and if anything, it almost seems to have kind of come out the other side, and now seems, or maybe it isn't. Maybe that stuff kind of works. It's not. It's sort of a really odd thing. It doesn't feel quite as bad or creepy as it might have done 10 years ago, where you have this sort of an escort who's dating a policeman. Feels like, well, that's an uncomfortable dynamic, but in the film, you were never meant to think of it like that in the 90s because he's a good guy. But maybe 10 years ago, you're going, oh, that maybe a bit dodgy. Whereas actually now, there's bits of it where I was going, that's quite, it feels almost, I don't think it's meant to be. I don't think he
No,
was
I don't
trying to
think
be
so.
progressive,
I don't
but
think
it
so.
almost feels that the way you'd view it now doesn't actually feel maybe as bad as it would have 10 years ago. You might have been like, actually, that stuff kind of feels a bit more modern than it may have done a decade ago.
I think you're right. I think because of the way kind of culture is, kind of culture has changed, and kind of feminist thought has changed maybe as well, in terms of like being more sex positive, and being more kind of comfortable with that kind of sex workers, and stuff like that. And I think like that is good, and you're right. There's this kind of push pull of like maybe they weren't deliberately being progressive, but certainly it seems progressive because this is an escort that is portrayed in this kind of like non-judgmental way, and most
Mm.
people, there's some characters who make a couple of comments, but they are generally kind of bad characters, or characters you're supposed to think are annoying. um and then so you kind of give it points for that, but then on the flip side of that, like most of the other women in the movie are kind of set dressing in underwear. Like,
Oh,
like you go, like
absolutely.
you get the woman who comes into the apartment. You get the dancing girls in Club Hell. You get the bikini shoot that they run through in the mini mart. Like it's like yeah, and obviously, as is typical with most Michael Bay movies, as we would come to learn, there's a lot of kind of leering shots of butts and cleavages, like
Yeah,
so
my uh, Bad Boys as Feminist Masterpiece essay wouldn't get that far. Having had my one bit at the start of like that actually isn't that bad, the more I'd try and write the next paragraph, I'd be like, I think I'm gonna have to tear this one up. I don't think it's good, but as things go, that does feel something. It's something, and that
yeah,
character is well liked. We're meant to like her. All the
yeah,
characters like her.
yeah,
She's a goodie. And it isn't. That's what I'd say about it. That character isn't portrayed as anything other than like she's one of the good guys for sure.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So
And it is, and I guess that, I mean, again, the other problem is that she is killed and then becomes the that plot point of actually getting into it, and the revenge plot is because she is killed. So that's not ideal either. having her then brutally murdered, so
yeah,
the guys can have some reason to avenge her isn't great. But there's something there that isn't
there,
that
there
isn't bad.
there is a nugget of accidental progressivism in the movie,
I
for
suppose.
sure.
I mean, in 1995, I guess we're probably slightly beyond that, we'd hope. But I guess even the idea of it being a mainstream film featuring two black leads, that is a mainstream film that's not for black audiences, it's for all audiences, all action audiences, is probably something. I can't think of something else that would have been so big and so aimed at such a mainstream audience
I
before this.
I mean, I guess so. I mean, yeah, no, that's very true, because obviously outside of like Eddie Murphy, there was still, even at that stage, even looking back at that era of cinema, there was still a divide between films that were aimed for predominantly white audiences and films that were aimed for predominantly black audiences. And of course, in '95 we had just come out. Well, we're still kind of in that boom of like kind of ghetto films, like Boys in the Hood, Menace to Society. I think Dead Presidents came out this
Hmm.
year of
Yeah, it'd
1995.
be
I
about that
think
time, yeah.
I think 95 was Dead Presidents. So like there was still that boom, and obviously those movies were very much aimed at specifically a black audience. Even though those are great movies for anybody. But yeah, so I guess from that point of view, like you say, to have like two black leads, and to have like a cast that's kind of a bit more multicultural, and not like not just purely white, with like one character of color. I guess, yeah, certainly on that level, yeah, it is progressive for the time. Yeah.
And I suppose, I mean, not that everyone is sort of covered in glory. But I suppose even the idea of it, I guess, being set in Miami means that you're more likely to have kind of Hispanic, Latino people, and it's more of a slightly multicultural. And you've got that thing, haven't you? We've got the other cops who are the kind of other buddy cops who are the kind of two Latino guys who are also in the precinct with them, who you feel are having these sort of parallel adventures and things. You have that kind of so it's slightly multicultural, almost, I think, perhaps accidentally, because it's a Miami set film, almost intrinsically means if they didn't do that, everyone would think it was weird that it wasn't slightly more multicultural.
Yeah, no, if you I guess if you have a purely white cast in that kind of area, it seems like a bit odd, I guess. So yeah. No,
sure. And that really comes into it, I suppose. There's the scene quite near the beginning where they get into the house and they break into the house, and there are those jokes about you've got to lose the bass in your voice to when you talk to that, and they're doing that, and that bit's like a good funny bit. But the start of that scene, I thought, was something really that felt quite authentic in a cop way, where they make a joke where Will Smith says to Mike Lawrence, when they get inside, they go, "Have you farted?" And he goes, "No." And then they both go, "Oh, dead guy." And that feels like a real sort of gallows humor that cops might have. Where it does sort of that. I remember that line feeling quite like, really struck me this time. Like, that actually feels like something. Like, it's that you walk into a house and there's a bad smell, and it's like the joke is, "Oh, have you farted?" "No." "Oh, it's a dead guy." And they both say it together in tandem. It's quite a good. That felt a good sort of cop sort of thing to me, like quite a nice line in that kind of film, because it kind of works. It's funny, but it is also that thing where it's a smell they're very familiar with. They know there's a body in here. You know, that felt like you could imagine that same line or something similar being in like a much more serious cop drama or something. Just that kind of noticing it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I was just thinking, it is funny, like thinking of like some of the strengths and weaknesses of the film. I think, as much as I'm not a big fan of Michael Bay, as we've obviously established throughout this episode, I think one of my favorite moments of the movie is the most Michael Bay moment in the movie, and that is when it's the kind of signature of like what Michael Bay will become. It's when it's revealed who Marcus is, who Mike is. They have the shootout, and then like shirt wide open, Will Smith chases and keeps pace with an SUV on foot. Like, and then like they have the hyper edited chase through the mini mart, and then it ends when like the bad guys get away, and we get what the classic arc shot that Michael Bay is known for on Marcus and Mike, and it is peak Michael Bay, or like what Michael Bay will become. And despite the fact I'm not a big fan, it is absolutely one of my favorite scenes in the movie.
Yeah, I think that's, and I think because it's not, you're totally right. And when it's become so, I mean, I guess he does it once. It's a moment.
Yes.
There's something like it's, I mean, it feels bad to talk about it in terms of Michael Bay, but that bit, that's cinema. That's a bit of cinema, that's a real, like, it's a moment where the moment is really noted.
Yeah.
And it feels like it's a real, like, and that became the thing, that became the sort of image of the film almost. Yes. The kind of signature image that you'd probably be on all the ads for the movie or something would be that. I mean, it is, it's you're right. Everything you said, it's exactly what you'd think would be something where when you see it another 6 or 7 times, you'd be roll your eyes at it. But I guess maybe that's the first time we see that. Maybe everyone went, "Oh, I like that bit, Michael," and he noted that in his head and went, "Great, I'll just keep doing that forever." And more. That's the start of it. Yeah, but it feels like it's a moment in the film that feels a bit like it's a bit of a punch the air kind of. Yeah, here they are. It works.
it does work, but like yeah, I think that's kind of when Michael Bay, the Michael Bay that we know, was kind of born. That one
Yeah,
scene, um,
yeah,
but like you say, it's great seeing it like once. It's quite and if you see like a hyper edited kind of scene, it can be quite fun
mm,
for a short period. Um, but like when it's a whole movie that's over 2 hours, it
yeah.
feels numbing.
That feels now like in this film, whether it was or not, it feels like it's designed. It's the crescendo, isn't it? It's the
Yeah,
crescendo to, and I guess it's something to do. How to end an action film that's um, where the main good guys are essentially at a loss. The bad guys have got away. How do you end that crescendo on a high and not a bit of a that was could got away, yeah. It just feels like you could like everything. What's happening on screen is actually a downer,
yeah,
but
yeah,
it sort of ends on a sort of high point, or and it feels like it's something like a real change or something happens. It feels like there's something like
a
it's
kind
a
of cut
cut,
off.
isn't it?
Yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah,
a cut. I'm sure if you every time it's on telly and they wanted to put a set of adverts in, I'm sure that's one of the ad breaks because it's like, yeah, that's it's an edit point right there. We can, you know, but you're right. Yeah, I
yeah,
agree with everything you said.
yeah. Because like that, I mean, absolutely. I'm sure like the ad break would be there because that's your gasp of breath before we launch into like the final
Yeah,
assault. The
yeah,
kind of final like big action set piece at the warehouse and all that kind of stuff. And it's kind of breathless action post that point. So like that's like your final kind of, and then it's like right now
yeah,
we're off to the
yeah.
races. So yeah, I'm sure that was the edit point, the ad point, when it was shown on TV. But yeah, I mean, I guess like I think we've successfully covered most of Bad Boys and most of its highs and most of its lows. Did you have any final thoughts before we wrap this one up?
I mean, a lot of the thoughts I have on it is almost predicated on how much I enjoyed the third and fourth film, I'd say, and
Yeah.
that they're essentially Bad Boys fan fiction, and that's what's so great about them. And the third and fourth film make the second film better by how much they're obviously made by guys who are just such big fans of the franchise,
Mm-hmm.
and they are silly. They almost do a kind of parody Michael Bay, which is sort of comes full circle. That now they're not by Michael Bay, but they're almost made by people who are doing it. They've got such a kind of they feel almost postmodern by what they're doing in them.
Yeah.
Um, they've really nailed who the characters are by then. They get it. They get who they are. By this one, it's like they're both old, but um, Will Smith still looks good. That's the sort of premise in the last two,
Yeah.
and they just play so well. The fourth one in particular, I mean, I probably will be the last one in the franchise, and wraps it all up so neatly that it makes it feel like it's all been planned. It's like a real like, oh, it's such a fan made thing. I really it really made me want to watch it. But I would say about the first Bad Boys is it's a film that I loved on release. When I revisited it a few years ago, I still thought it was great. This time is the first time I think in some ways its shine has slightly come off, which I wasn't expecting because I was really looking forward to revisiting it based on how much I'd enjoyed the third one and especially the fourth movie.
Mm.
And it isn't quite it is a bit more dated than I would have hoped, and it isn't a film that I enjoyed this time as much as I have done on previous occasions. But
Mm.
there's so much to like in it. It's just that you're just much more aware of its shortcomings, which is but its high points are what made Bad Boys a franchise, really.
Yeah. No, I would absolutely agree with it. And like I don't know, there's this weird swing because like I say, I first saw it when I was maybe 12. Loved it. Watched it. One of the VHSs I had was that was in regular rotation. Watched it quite a lot. Loved it then. Um, Yeah, on this latest rewatch, like I didn't love it quite so much. I was kind of middling on it, but still thought, it has these kind of great high points. But actually, kind of talking about it and kind of talking through the high points, I'm kind of like, oh, I put it on my letterbox as kind of 3 stars, and I'm like, oh, maybe that's a little harsh. I don't know. Um, so yeah, it's been very fun to talk about, and it's kind of made me reflect on it again more. And so maybe it ticked slightly back up in my estimation, even though I still don't think it's a great movie, because I do think that second act does kind of sag, and the all as much as I love watching Martin Lawrence and Will Smith in these movies, they do take up all the oxygen, which means that there's not a lot left for the rest of the movie, which is detrimental to the plot while also offsetting it because you're still getting a lot of entertainment on the other side. So, it's probably, if people are coming at it the first time and don't have a history with it and didn't see it when they were 12 or 15 or whatever, like maybe they won't connect with it as much. But yeah, I think like that's kind of the final thought on Bad Boys. So it just leaves me to thank you very much, Nat, for coming on this episode of All 90s Action all the time. And if you just want to plug your own podcast one last time before we
Oh
head off.
yeah, yeah. I would say if you're a fan of this podcast, I would say I would urge you to listen to uh, Consume and Obey, or to give its full title, the John Carpenter Appreciation Society presents Consume and Obey, because I think you'd probably find a lot to enjoy in it.
Excellent, excellent. All right. Well, I definitely recommend that listeners check that out. And yes, that's all for this month. Please do join us again next month, where we talk about obscure Christopher Lambert film Hunted that I've not seen yet, but look forward to checking that out. And hopefully, you will look forward to listening to that episode. Until then, though, see ya.